On a July night in 2003, Christine Paolilla gunned down 4 of her friends in a fit of jealousy that is now known as the Clear Lake Massacre. Christine fatally shot Rachel Karlsen, Tiffany Rowell, Marcus Priscilla, and Adalbert Sanchez in Rowell's Clear Lake City, Texas home on July 18, 2003. At the time of the murders, she was just 17 years old. She committed the crimes alongside her boyfriend, Christopher Snyder. For 3 years, the two of them evaded capture as police struggled to identify the culprits. Then, an anonymous tip in 2006 led investigators straight to Paolilla. The vicious Clear Lake Massacre had been solved at last, and the families of the victims finally had the answers they'd sought for years. Christine Marie Paolilla was born on Long Island, New York, on March 31, 1986. Her father died in a construction accident when she was just 2 years old. Her mother, Lori, later moved the family to the suburbs of Houston. When she was in kindergarten, Paolilla was diagnosed with alopecia, a condition that caused her hair, eyebrows, and eyelashes to fall out. She also struggled with poor vision and had to wear thick glasses. Sadly, her appearance made her a target of cruel jokes and teasing by her peers, which caused low self-esteem. Paolilla faced severe bullying every day during her school years due to the wigs she wore and the eyebrows she drew on each morning to conceal her baldness. In an interview, Lori Paolilla described the pain her daughter went through that was devastating. She had poor vision, so she had what I guess most folks would know as Coke bottle glasses, and started being ridiculed by young children. Classmates would come up behind her, pull her wig off her head. It was so painful to watch. Christine Paolilla attended Clear Lake High School in Houston. She eventually befriended 2 popular students, Rachel Karlsen and Tiffany Rowell. The girls taught her how to change her appearance with makeup and clothing to better fit in with her peers. The transformation was so drastic that in 2003, Paolilla's fellow classmates voted her Miss Irresistible. Around the same time, Paolilla began dating 21-year-old Christopher Lee Snyder, who was a known criminal. Paolilla's mother and stepfather disapproved of their relationship, as did Karlsen and Rowell. Snyder's frequent drug use and extensive criminal record concerned those who cared about the young, impressionable girl. Unfortunately, their concerns were validated when Paolilla began using drugs herself. According to Snyder's family, the relationship was doomed from the start. They cited the vicious arguments Paolilla and Snyder frequently had. One even resulted in Paolilla spending the night on the front lawn of his family's home, threatening to kill them all. Still, Paolilla stubbornly refused to leave Snyder, a decision that would have tragic results. On July 18, 2003, Christine Paolilla and Christopher Snyder visited Tiffany Rowell's home in Clear Lake City, where Karlsen, Rowell's boyfriend Marcus Priscilla, and Priscilla's cousin Adalbert Sanchez were all hanging out together. The plan was to simply steal drugs from the house and leave. But the evening took a dark turn when Snyder began arguing with Priscilla. The confrontation escalated, and Snyder and Paolilla began shooting. It's not clear who killed who, but the couple fired at least 40 rounds in total. All 4 of the victims had numerous bullet wounds, and Rowell and Karlsen were both shot in the groin. Karlsen initially survived the onslaught and began to crawl through a puddle of her own blood to reach the phone and call 911. When Paolilla saw that she was still alive, she began viciously beating her to death with the butt of a revolver, while Karlsen cried out, "Why?" Less than an hour after committing the murders, Snyder drove Paolilla to Walgreens so she could clock into her job at the makeup counter like nothing had happened. Due to a lack of evidence at the crime scene, police initially suspected the murders were drug-related. It wasn't until 2006 that the truth came out. For 3 years, the cold-blooded Clear Lake Massacre went unsolved. Paolilla and Snyder broke up in 2004 after he went to jail for stealing a car. She entered rehab in Texas, where she met her soon-to-be husband, Stanley Justin Rott. The two tied the knot in March 2005. 4 months later, on the second anniversary of the murders, Paolilla came across a news report about the unsolved case on TV. When she saw the composite sketches of the suspects, she confessed to Rott that she and Snyder were responsible. The couple went into hiding, living out of a motel room in San Antonio. A year later, police received an anonymous tip. The caller said he had met Paolilla in rehab, and she had confessed to him that she had murdered the 4 victims in the Clear Lake massacre. Acting on this information, authorities arrested Christine Paolilla outside her motel room. Rott told the police about his wife's confession, and he revealed to them a shocking twist to the story. Paolilla had told him that she saw Karlsen still clinging to life and decided to finish her off by bludgeoning her friend to death. When interrogated by detectives, Paolilla shifted all the blame onto her former boyfriend, Snyder. She claimed that it was Snyder who came up with the idea to rob her friends, but their plans went terribly wrong. Both Paolilla and Snyder, who was still at large, were charged with capital murder. Snyder found out about the arrest warrant against him and took his own life in August 2006. In October 2008, Paolilla was found guilty of 4 counts of capital murder. As she was a juvenile at the time of the crimes, she avoided the death penalty and instead received a life sentence. The question remains, why did she do it? Christine Paolilla never apologized for the killings, and she has never given a motive. However, psychiatrist Gail Saltz believes that her actions were driven by envy and jealousy towards her popular friends. Snyder's sister Brandy agrees that jealousy was the motive for murder. According to reports, Brandy said, "I remember her being intensely jealous. There must have been some underlying jealousy between Paolilla and Karlsen. When I saw photos of Karlsen, I knew instantly. She was very beautiful." Brenda Lafferty was beautiful, intelligent, and assertive. And those were some of the reasons why her brothers-in-law, Ron and Dan Lafferty, decided to murder her and her 15-month-old daughter Erica in 1984. Mormon fundamentalists claiming to be guided by God, Ron, and Dan insisted that they were driven to murder by a divine message they called the removal revelation. But the truth behind their motives was far more earthbound. Ron, who had received the message, was furious with Brenda for helping his wife to leave him after he embraced polyamory. This is the story of Brenda Lafferty, whose murder by Ron and Dan Lafferty inspired the book and TV show Under the Banner of Heaven. Brenda Lafferty was born on July 19, 1960, into a Mormon family living in Logan, Utah. She spent most of her childhood in Ithaca, New York, and Kimberly, Idaho, and enjoyed an especially close relationship with 2 of her sisters, Betty and Bonnie, who were around her same age. Beautiful, intelligent, and popular among her peers, Brenda used her good looks to secure a college scholarship from the Miss Twin Falls, Idaho, beauty pageant. She spent a year at the University of Idaho and the College of Southern Idaho before she transferred to Brigham Young University back in Utah. Brenda's mother had gone to BYU, and Brenda hoped to study broadcast journalism. There, Brenda also met her husband, Alan Lafferty. They quickly fell in love and married, and Brenda gave birth to their daughter, Erica Lane Lafferty, on April 28, 1983, after her college graduation. But Brenda's marriage with Alan was complex. Though the Wright family liked Alan, he could be controlling and didn't want Brenda to work. What's more, 2 of his brothers, Ron and Dan Lafferty, had begun to embrace an extreme form of Mormonism. They had joined a breakaway polygamist sect called the School of Prophets and started to preach it to their brothers. Ron's extremism upset his wife, Diana, who found that her husband suddenly expected a servant instead of a spouse. She confided in Brenda about the deepening cracks in her marriage, and Brenda encouraged her to take her children and leave Ron. Diana really loved Brenda, Brenda's sister, Sharon Wright stated. Because all of the other Lafferty brothers had wives that they treated like second-class citizens, Brenda ended up giving Diana the courage she needed to leave. Diana took Brenda's advice, and Ron Lafferty would not soon forget it. In early 1984, shortly after the end of his marriage, Ron Lafferty claimed to have received divine instructions from God. Curiously, this revelation demanded that he murder people he blamed for his problems. Brenda, a woman named Chloe Lowe, who'd supported his wife, and a man named Richard Stowe, who had overseen Ron's excommunication from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Ron shared the message with his brother Dan and his brother Alan, Brenda's husband. Alan later testified that he responded to the message, which Dan and Ron called their removal revelation, with disbelief. I told him that God had made no such revelation to me, and I would protect Brenda and Erica with my life, he said in court. But Alan did not tell Brenda about it. If he had told Brenda about Ron's revelation, she would have been out of there in a minute, and she'd still be alive today, Brenda's sister, Betty stated. But Brenda didn't know anything about it. Indeed, Brenda Lafferty had no idea that she was in danger. And on July 24, 1984, Ron and Dan Lafferty put their murderous plan into action. Accompanied by two drifters named Charles Carnes and Richard Knapp, Ron and Dan Lafferty made their way to Brenda's apartment. While Carnes and Knapp waited in the car, they forced their way inside and began their attack. As Erica, 15 months, wailed from her crib, Carnes could hear Ron calling Brenda bad names and a liar, and the sound of the brothers physically beating her. According to testimony he gave at Ron's trial, the brothers strangled Brenda with a vacuum cord and slit her throat. Then Dan walked into baby Erica's room and slit her throat as well. I walked in Erica's room. I talked to her for a minute. I said, "I'm not sure why I'm supposed to do this, but I guess God wants you home," Dan Lafferty said. Dan claimed that he killed Brenda as well, describing her killing like something out of the scriptures. But Carnes testified that Ron took credit for Brenda's death when he returned to the car. "I killed her. I can't believe I killed her," Ron allegedly said. The four men went to fulfill the rest of Ron's removal revelation, but their other victims escaped unscathed. Lowe wasn't home, and they missed the turn to Stowe's house. Instead, they kept driving toward Nevada. Meanwhile, Alan Lafferty came home and discovered the gruesome scene. "I went over to Brenda, and I prayed." Alan testified in court. He called the police. Alan knew exactly who had killed his wife and daughter. Ron and Dan Lafferty were arrested in Reno, Nevada, on August 7, 1984. They were soon charged with 2 counts of criminal homicide, 2 counts of aggravated burglary, and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit homicide. Dan was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison. Ron was sentenced to death, but died in 2019 before his execution. Before his wife's murder in June 2009, Eli Weaver had numerous affairs with women he met through online dating sites, where he called himself an Amish stud. But only one mistress was willing to kill for him. From the outside, it may have seemed as if Barbara Weaver had a perfectly happy life as an Amish housewife. At 30 years old, she had been married to her husband Eli for 10 years, and they had 5 young children together in the picturesque, conservative community of Apple Creek, Ohio. But on June 2, 2009, Barbara was found shot to death in her own home, and everything pointed to Eli Weaver as the culprit. The Weavers belonged to a conservative subgroup of the Old Order Amish. Their religion didn't allow them to have cell phones, internet, or even to take photos of themselves. They traveled around town by horse and buggy, but as investigators dug into the Weavers' life, they found Eli didn't exactly adhere to those rules. Not only did he have a secret cell phone, he had several extramarital affairs with other women, most of whom he found in an online chat room where he called himself Amish Stud. Who wants to do an Amish guy? His profile read, "By all appearances, Barbara and Eli Weaver had a good marriage. They had a good community of friends and neighbors." Barbara was a very friendly, sociable person. She was kind of laid back, but super nice. "A gentle soul," neighbor Mary Akers said in an interview. Eli was very outgoing. He would often come over fairly late in the evening and ask for a ride. And he was very considerate. He would apologize for interrupting me. He had charm. Mary was a Mennonite taxi driver, someone who would give rides to the Amish in her community to places they couldn't reach by horse and buggy. But in the later years of the Weavers' marriage, they began having problems. Eli was having several affairs, and he was withholding money from Barbara. Fanny Troyer, Barbara's sister, said Eli wouldn't even give her money to care for the children or buy groceries. Eli ran a gun store, and business was fine, she said. It wasn't about the money, it was about control. The Weaver children also reportedly saw Eli physically abuse Barbara, but she never reported it because, as one Amish leader said, she would have been asked, "What did you do that your husband would treat you like this?" Barbara was struggling with their marital problems. She wrote in a letter to her counselor, "Where did my friend love, trustworthy husband go to? He hates me to the core." Eli Weaver even left his family and the church twice to live as English. Both times, he was back within a few months, begging for forgiveness. Barbara Rubber was another Mennonite taxi driver in the Apple Creek community. Barbara and Eli met in 2003 when she was 33 and he was 23. They began having an affair. In the months leading up to the murder, Weaver had been asking several people to kill his wife. Most didn't take him seriously, but he said in his testimony that when he mentioned it to Barbara, she ran away with the idea. They began plotting the murder in the fall of 2008. Barbara performed 840 internet searches on poisoning, and investigators found a series of text messages between Weaver and Barbara discussing the murder method. "I thought if we could get that fly poison stuff in a spice cupcake, she might not detect it," reads a text message from Barbara. "Maybe you could blow up the house?" Eli texted Barbara. "What about your kids?" she asked. "The kids will go to heaven because they're innocent," Weaver wrote. In the end, they settled on using a gun. But why did Eli Weaver need to kill his wife? Why didn't he just leave her? If he had left, he would have been shunned, said Andrew Hyde, Weaver's attorney. If his wife is dead, they pat him on the back. Early in the morning, on June 2nd, 2009, one of the Weaver children found their mother dead and covered in blood in her bed and ran to the neighbor's house for help. Investigators found Barbara Weaver had been shot with a .410 shotgun. There was a pile of cash in the bedroom, indicating robbery was not the motive. When Barbara was found, Eli Weaver was fishing on Lake Erie with friends. He had left at 3 a.m., but neighbors and friends of the family pointed police in the direction of Barbara Rabber, who didn't have an alibi for the time of the murder. Barbara said she took a gun from her husband's gun cabinet and admitted to entering the Weaver home at 4:30 a.m. the day of the murder. She said she didn't remember loading the weapon and claimed she only meant to scare Barbara Weaver, but the gun was discharged accidentally. On June 10th, just over a week after Barbara Weaver's murder, Eli confessed to conspiring with Barbara Rabber to kill his wife. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder in exchange for his testimony against Rabber, who was charged with murder. The trial began in September 2009. Weaver testified that he and Rabber discussed the plan the day before the murder. He told her he would be leaving at 3 a.m. for a fishing trip, and the basement door would be left unlocked for her. Rabber recanted her previous story, saying she was never in the Weaver home. The murder weapon was never found, and Rabber's prints weren't in the house. Rabber's attorney argued that Eli Weaver was the one who killed Barbara. claiming he shot her before leaving for his fishing trip. But Weaver testified that he and Rayber met in his barn on June 9th. He said, Rayber described the murder in detail and told him she was sorry for everything. Weaver said, Rayber asked him how to clean a gun so it didn't look like it had been fired recently. With the help of Weaver's testimony, Rayber was convicted and sentenced to 23 years to life. Weaver was sentenced to 15 years to life as part of his plea deal. Weaver is eligible for parole next year, while Rayber won't be eligible for parole until 2032. In one of her last letters to her counselor, Barbara Weaver wrote, I often think of Christ's words, forgive him, for he knows not what he does. In 2000, drug dealers kidnapped Nicholas Markowitz and then partied with him for days, before finally killing him outside of Santa Barbara, providing the chilling basis for the film Alpha Dog. Nicholas Markowitz was a high school theater kid who was an avid reader. His older half-brother, Benjamin, ran with an amateur gang of wannabe tough guys who sold marijuana and ecstasy. While their parents hoped to shield Nick from those criminal elements, they came for him anyway. That seedy underbelly of the West Hills neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley consisted of high school dropouts and impressionable youths, and at its center was a man with the name of an outlaw and temperament of a bully, Jesse James Hollywood, who delegated drug deals and always collected his debts. Ben Markowitz owed Hollywood $1,200 when he began to distance himself. Frustrated, he couldn't muscle Ben back into the fold, and determined to save his reputation, Hollywood abducted Nick Markowitz to spur his brother's repayment on August 6, 2000. But when he realized kidnapping could land him in prison, Hollywood took drastic measures and had the 15-year-old murdered. Ben was shocked. He knew his old acquaintances liked to talk tough, but he never considered they would do something like this. In my worst nightmares, he said, I never would have thought that would have happened. Nicholas Samuel Markowitz was born on September 19, 1984, in Los Angeles, California. The summer before his sophomore year at El Camino, Real High School, he spent most days going for walks, hanging out with his older brother, and preparing to get his driver's license. But on August 6, 2000, he was abducted at 1 p.m. after sneaking out of his house to avoid arguing with his parents, Jeff and Susan. A fellow West Hills resident, Jesse James Hollywood, came from a family of means. He had excelled at high school baseball, but was expelled during his sophomore year. When a later injury turned the 20-year-old dropout's athletic dreams into dust, he began to sell drugs. His amateur crew consisted of former school pals like 20-year-old William Skidmore, 21-year-old Jesse Rugg, and 21-year-old Benjamin Markowitz, who still owed him money. Hollywood had only been a dealer for a year when he went to collect his cash from Ben, only to happen upon Nick walking down the street. Hollywood pulled over his van and dragged Nicholas Markowitz inside with the aid of Rugge and Skidmore. A neighbor witnessed the incident and called 911 with the license plate, but police couldn't find the van. Markowitz was bound with duct tape and had his pager, wallet, Valium, and weed confiscated. Over the next 2 days, Markowitz was shuttled between various homes with the promise that he'd soon be freed. At Rugge's Santa Barbara house, he played video games with his captors and smoked and drank with them. Markowitz even attended their parties, making friends with 17-year-old Graham Presley. He told me that it was okay because he was doing it for his brother, and that as long as his brother was okay, he was okay, said Presley. Markowitz even declined an offer to run when Presley drove him around town, stating he didn't want to complicate a seemingly temporary matter. Hollywood even told Rugg that Markowitz would be free soon, spurring a Lemon Tree Motel pool party on August 8th. I'm going to take you home, Rugg told Markowitz that night. I'll put you on a Greyhound. I'm going to get you home. Unbeknownst to his crew, Hollywood had spoken to his family lawyer and gotten lethally paranoid about a potential kidnapping charge. He became convinced that murdering Nicholas Markowitz was his only way forward and asked Ruggie to do his dirty work for him. Rugg declined, leading Hollywood to contact 21-year-old Ryan Hoyt. "We got a little situation," said Hollywood. "You're gonna take care of it for me. And that's how you're gonna clear your debt." Like Ben Markowitz, Hoyt owed Hollywood money. When he arrived to meet him, Hollywood handed him a semi-automatic pistol and offered to wipe the slate clean with an additional $400 payment if he killed Markowitz. In the early morning hours of August 9th, Hoyt and Rugg duct-taped Markowitz's mouth and hands. With Presley, they drove Markowitz to the Lizard's Mouth Trail near Santa Barbara in the early morning hours of August 9th. They walked the terrified teen to a shallow grave at a remote campsite 12 miles away. Hitting him over the head with a shovel, Hoyt dumped him in the hole and shot him 9 times. Then they covered his grave with dirt and branches and drove away. Nicholas Markowitz was found by hikers on August 12th, after which many who befriended him during captivity came forward. Police arrested Rugg, Hoyt, and Presley within a week, while Hollywood had fled to Colorado before his trail went cold on August 23rd. Hollywood remained a fugitive for almost 6 years until he was arrested in Rio de Janeiro in 2005. Police found him under the alias of Michael Costaguro by tracing his father's phone calls. While his friends and family painted a glowing picture at trial, he was sentenced to life in prison. Hoyt was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Rugg was convicted of kidnapping and served 11 years, while Skidmore was convicted of the same but sentenced to 9 years via plea deal. Presley, underage at the time, was sent to a juvenile facility for 8 years. From the outside, it seemed as though West Virginia teenagers Rachel Shoaf, Shelia Eddy, and Skylar Nees were best friends. But on July 6, 2012, Shoaf and Eddy lured an unsuspecting Nees into the woods of Pennsylvania, counted to 3, and stabbed her to death. For several months, the teenage killers kept their horrific crime a secret. Then, Shoaf finally broke under the pressure and confessed to the murder, leading the police to where they'd hidden Nees's body. When asked why they killed her, Shoaf would say it was because we just didn't like her. Born on June 10, 1996, Rachel Shoaf seemed to have a lot of promise. Described by those who knew her as an adventurous and happy girl, Shoaf appeared to be thriving by the time she was attending high school in Morgantown, West Virginia. Shoaf had good grades, took singing and piano lessons, and was involved in theater. She also had 2 best friends, Shelia Eddy and Skylar Nees, and the girls did everything together. She loved life, and there was no reason for her not to. Kelly Kearns, Shoaf's close family friend, stated, "People around her loved her." Soon, however, Kearns noticed changes in Shoaf's behavior. The teen started sneaking out, skipping classes, and regularly smoking marijuana. Meanwhile, there appeared to be growing tension in her friendship group with Skylar Nees. In early July 2012, Nees's posts on social media seemed to hint that she was feeling excluded by her friends. "It really doesn't take much to piss me off," Nees wrote in one post on X, then known as Twitter, soon after. She wrote, "Sick of being at home. Thanks, friends. Love hanging out with you all too." The next day, she wrote, "You doing stuff like that is why I will never completely trust you." Chillingly, the following morning, Skylar Nees vanished. Shortly after midnight on July 6, 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Nees snuck out of her home in Star City, West Virginia, to meet up with Rachel Shoaf and Shelia Eddy to smoke marijuana. Later, surveillance footage would show Skylar Nees entering Eddy's vehicle at about 12:35 a.m. Nees was never seen alive again. While Nees had apparently believed this would be a night out with friends like any other, Shoaf and Eddy had other plans. They had secretly brought along knives, which they'd hidden in their hoodies, as well as cleaning supplies, a shovel, and clean clothes to change into later. The girls smoked weed and drove around, eventually stopping in a remote wooded area just over the state line in Pennsylvania. Once there, Nees turned around to go find a lighter in the car. Then, Shoaf and Eddie counted 1, 2, 3, and literally stabbed their friend in the back, attacking her until she was dead. Afterward, the girls tried to bury her. When they found that the ground was too hard to dig into, they covered her body with branches and dirt instead. It would be 6 months before her remains were finally discovered. Just hours after the murder, Skylar Nees' parents realized she wasn't in her room and reported her missing. At first, police assumed she had run away, and her friends went along with the news that she disappeared. That morning, Sheila Eddy called Skylar Nees' parents and explained that she and Rachel Shoaf had been with her the night before. She admitted that they had snuck out, picked Nees up around 11 p.m., and then drove around smoking marijuana for a bit before dropping Nees off near her house, just before midnight. Later, security footage would reveal that this timeline was off, as the girls didn't even pick Nees up until well after midnight. Meanwhile, Rachel Shoaf had decided to go on a last-minute boat ride with her mom and her family friend, Kelly Kearns. When Rachel Shoaf's mom, Patricia, brought up the news that Rachel's friend Skylar Nees had been reported missing, Rachel's behavior didn't seem too unusual. I mean, she was texting all the time, Kearns later remembered. But you see so much of that, it didn't really faze us. Then, the day after her best friend supposedly vanished without a trace, Rachel Shoaf left for a 2-week-long church camp. As time went on, it eventually became clear that Rachel Shoaf and Sheila Eddy knew something about Skylar Nees' disappearance. The FBI even got involved, searching the girls' lockers and confiscating their computers. Still, both Shoaf and Eddy stuck to their previous story to a T. Their stories were verbatim, the same. No one's story is exactly the same unless it's rehearsed, one police officer said about the girls. Then, in late December 2012, Rachel Shoaf suffered a nervous breakdown and was briefly admitted to a psychiatric hospital. When she was released in early January 2013, she finally decided to confess, telling police that she and Eddy had planned and executed the murder of Skylar Nees. When asked why they'd done it, she simply said, "We just didn't like her." About 6 months after the disappearance of Skylar Nees, Rachel Shoaf led the police to the area where she and Eddy had hidden the body in Pennsylvania. Eventually, authorities were able to recover the remains. By May 2013, police had enough evidence to arrest both Rachel and Sheila. Those who knew Rachel Shoaf personally were stunned that she could have committed such a brutal murder. There was never any sign. Not a mean kid, not a bully, didn't torture animals, Kelly Kearns said. With all of the potential and morals, I don't even get where this came from. After securing a plea deal, Rachel Shoaf readily pleaded guilty to the second-degree murder of Skylar Nees. In February 2014, she was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Before her sentencing, she apologized to the Nees family. "The person that did that was not the real me," she said. "I became scared, caught up in something that I did not want to do." Nees' father did not accept Shoaf's apologies. "Rachel Shoaf murdered my daughter in cold blood," Dave Nees said in response. "She can take her apologies and sit on them." Shoaf served the first part of her sentence in a juvenile facility, and she was relocated to a state prison after her 18th birthday. Sheila Eddy, meanwhile, was sentenced to life in prison for first-degree murder, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. While Rachel Shoaf initially claimed she and Sheila Eddy had murdered their friend because they just didn't like her, not everyone was satisfied with that motive. In fact, some theorized that the pair may have had a secret sexual relationship and that they killed Nees because she found out. At her parole hearing in May 2023, Shoaf, then 26, confirmed this theory, claiming she and Eddie had been seeing one another, and they were afraid of what would happen if Nies revealed their secret. After things became known with the relationship, there was tension between us, she said. It was hostile and violent. In our teenage minds, we didn't know how to handle the conflict, and we just wanted it to stop. Skylar Nies' family, however, insisted that she would never have outed her friends. She had other gay friends, they said, and wouldn't have been bothered by their relationship. In a statement to the parole board, Nies' father Dave Nies strongly recommended against granting Shoaf parole. This narcissistic, first-degree, cold-blooded killer is not sorry for the brutal murder of my only child, he wrote in the statement. The date of July 6, 2012 was chosen for a specific reason. You see, this beast wanted the killing out of the way before she left for church camp. Just another task to mark off of her list, like standing over my child saying, "Die," as my baby girl took her last breath, because the evil butcher didn't want to be her friend. Rachel Shoaf was denied parole. She is projected to be released in 2028. On New Year's Day, 1991, fire emergency services were called to a residential fire in Murphys, California at 2:26 p.m. They were confronted by Karl Karlsen, who said he just rescued his 3 children from inside the burning home, but that someone else was still inside. He said he wasn't able to get inside to save his wife, Christina. First responders found Christina's body in the bathroom of the rundown house. Karl told officials that the fire may have started because of a utility light that had fallen. Fire officials determined that the origin of the fire was directly outside the bathroom. Christina had been taking a bath while Karl worked in the garage. Officials observed some red flags, according to John Clear, Lieutenant of Investigations, Seneca County Sheriff's Office. The window in the bathroom where Christina died was boarded up. The odor of kerosene was prominent. However, Karlsen told investigators they couldn't afford to fix the broken pane. He said that they used kerosene to heat the house, and that a container of it had spilled and seeped into the carpet days before the blaze. On its face, it looks like it could be an accident, said Clear. But when someone dies, the default is to consider it suspicious until you know better. The investigators weren't going to just accept that this was an accidental fire based upon Karl Karlsen's story, added former state trooper Jeff Arnold. An autopsy was performed the following day, while investigators looked for leads on the cause of the fire. The physician found soot in Christina's lungs, but no evidence indicating she was injured or incapacitated before the blaze. The autopsy determined Christina died from smoke inhalation. It didn't conclude if the death was an accident or a homicide. The day after the fire, Karlsen surprised Christina's family and authorities when he announced he was moving with his daughters, Erin and Katie, and son, Levi, to his hometown in Seneca County, New York. He didn't stay for any funeral services or purchase a headstone. He just packs up and leaves, said Clear. Christina's family was so suspicious, they decided to collect their own evidence. Despite their efforts, on March 3, 1991, Christina's death was officially ruled an accident. There just wasn't enough hard evidence to prove otherwise, said Moreland. State Farm Insurance paid a life insurance policy of approximately $215,000 to Karlsen. I've worked with insurance investigators, and if an arrest is not made, insurance policies are not going to deny the claim, explained Clear. Was that payout a motive for murder? Investigators considered that. Karlsen moved on and purchased a section of a farm from his parents. About a year later, he married Cindy Best. On November 20, 2008, 17 years after Christina's death, Cindy called 911. She frantically told the dispatcher that their truck had fallen off a jack. Levi, now 23 with a family of his own, was pinned underneath. He wasn't breathing. Officials found that Levi had a crushing compression type of wound to his chest. All indications showed that he had perished hours ago. According to Karlsen, Levi was working on the truck when he and Cindy left to go to a funeral. When they returned, he was crushed under the half-ton vehicle. The family doctor signed off on the death as accidental, according to investigators. There was no autopsy done. Christina's mother, Arlene Meltzer, heard the news about Levi. "I felt really bad, but I didn't think it was an accident. I thought, it's happened again," she said. In February 2012, Clear received a call from Levi's cousin, Jackie Heimel, who asked if he had investigated Levi's death. She said, "There's a good chance he was murdered by his father." Through conversations with Cindy, Heimel had heard things that had raised her suspicions. She talks about the fact that Karl had made money off of Christina's death, and that Christina's children had never seen any of that money, Moreland stated. Karlsen had taken out insurance policies on the lives of Christina and Levi shortly before their deaths. He was the beneficiary in both cases. Investigators reopened the case into Levi's death. On April 9, 2012, they called Cindy Karlsen, who was estranged from her husband. She agreed to cooperate and was interviewed numerous times over the following months. A profile of Karlsen emerged as a controlling and emotionally abusive narcissist. According to Cindy, Karlsen and his son had been at odds for quite a while, but appeared to be mending fences. Karlsen had been the one to convince Levi to get the $700,000 life insurance policy, which was taken out 17 days before Levi's death. Cindy said she didn't find out about it until after Levi was dead. "Karl had pretty much blown most of the money on a get-rich-quick scheme," said Clear. Before separating from Karlsen, Cindy had a private investigator do some digging on her husband and learned Karlsen had taken out an insurance policy on her. Cindy agreed to wear a wire to catch Karlsen talking about his son's death. Although he didn't confess, Karlsen made an admission that enabled police to bring him in for questioning. Karlsen's version of the events before Levi's death were inconsistent. He initially said Levi had been crushed before going to his aunt's funeral. Karlsen then said he caused the truck to fall, freaked out, and left. "I don't believe it for a second that he accidentally dropped the truck on his son," said Clear. "But for legal purposes, it doesn't really matter. Under New York state law, that's depraved indifference. That's murder in the second degree." Karlsen was arrested for second-degree murder and insurance fraud. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 years. In a stroke of good luck, an investigator in California has preserved copies of all the records related to the death of Christina Karlsen. It had been determined that kerosene had been poured on the floor just before the fire was lit. On December 8, 2012, the Calaveras County District Attorney's Office officially reopened the investigation into her death. Karlsen's trial for her murder began in 2020, nearly 3 decades after her death. On February 3, 2020, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder. Karlsen was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In 1965, 16-year-old Sylvia Likens was sent to the home of a family friend, Gertrude Banasowski, while her parents were traveling. But Likens never made it out alive. Gertrude Banasowski and her children tortured Sylvia Likens to death. The perpetrators even managed to involve an entire neighborhood of kids to help them commit this brutal murder. As the autopsy in the Sylvia Likens case later showed, she endured unimaginable torment before she died. Nevertheless, her killers faced almost no justice at all. Sylvia Likens' parents were both carnival workers and were therefore on the road more often than not. They struggled to make ends meet, as her father Lester had only an 8th-grade education and a total of 5 children to care for. Jenny was quiet and withdrawn with a limp from polio. Sylvia was more confident and went by the nickname Cookie, and had been described as pretty, though she had a missing front tooth. In July 1965, Lester Likens decided to take up with the carnival again, while his wife was jailed for shoplifting that summer. Sylvia's brothers, Danny and Benny, were put into the care of their grandparents. With few other options, Sylvia and Jenny were sent to stay with a family friend named Gertrude Banaszewski. Gertrude was every bit as poor as the Likens and had 7 of her own kids to support in her rundown home. She made little cash by charging her neighbors a few dollars to iron their laundry. She'd already been through multiple divorces, some of which resulted in physical abuse against her, and dealt with a crippling depression through heavy doses of prescription drugs. She was in no condition to take care of 2 teenage girls. The Likens, though, didn't think they had any other choice. Lester Likens cryptically requested that Banaszewski straighten his daughters out when he placed them in her care for $20 a week. For the first 2 weeks at the Banaszewskis, Sylvia and her sister were treated kindly enough, though Gertrude's oldest daughter, 17-year-old Paula, seemed to butt heads with Sylvia often. Then one week their father's payment came in late. "I took care of you 2 for 2 weeks for nothing," Gertrude spat at Sylvia and Jenny. She grabbed Sylvia by the arm, dragged her into a room, and closed the door. Jenny could only sit outside the door and listen as her sister screamed. The money arrived the following day, but the torture had just begun. Gertrude soon began to abuse both Sylvia and Jenny in broad daylight. Though a frail woman, Gertrude used a heavy paddle and thick leather belt from one of her husbands, who had been a cop. When she was too exhausted or too weak to discipline the girls herself, Paula stepped in to take her place. Sylvia, however, soon became the focus of the abuse. Gertrude Banaszewski demanded that Jenny join in, lest she take her sister's place as the brunt of the abuse. Gertrude accused Sylvia of stealing from her and burned the girl's fingertips. She took her to a church function and force-fed her free hot dogs until she was sick. Then, as punishment for throwing up good food, she forced her to eat her own vomit. She allowed her children, in fact, encouraged her children to partake in the abuse of Sylvia and her sister. The Banaszewski kids practiced karate on Sylvia, slammed her into walls and onto the floor. They used her skin as an ashtray, threw her downstairs and cut open her skin and rubbed salt into her wounds. After this, she would often be cleansed in a scalding hot bath. Gertrude gave sermons on the evils of sexual immortality, while Paula stomped on Sylvia's vagina. Paula, who herself was pregnant, accused Sylvia of being with child and mutilated the girl's genitals. Gertrude's 12-year-old son, John Jr., delighted in forcing the girl to lick his youngest sibling's soiled diapers clean. Sylvia was so beaten that she was unable to use the bathroom voluntarily. When she wet her mattress, Gertrude decided that the girl was no longer fit to live with the rest of her children. The 16-year-old was then locked in the basement without food or access to the bathroom. Gertrude spread every story she could imagine to get the local kids to join in on the beatings. She told her daughter that Sylvia had called her a whore and got her daughter's friends to come over and beat her up for it. Later during the trial, some of the kids were open about how Gertrude had recruited them. One teenage girl named Anna Sisko recalled how Gertrude told her that Sylvia had been saying, "She said my mother went out with all sorts of men and got $5 for going to bed with the men." Anna never bothered to find out if it was true. Gertrude told her, "I don't care what you do to Sylvia." She invited over to her home and just watched as Anna threw Sylvia down to the ground, beat her face, and kick her. Gertrude told her own children that Sylvia was a prostitute. Then she had Ricky Hobbs, a neighborhood boy, and her 11-year-old daughter Marie carved the words, "I'm a prostitute," and proud of it into her abdomen with a heated needle. At one point, Sylvia's older sister Diana attempted to see the girls under Gertrude's care, but was turned away at the door. Jenny later reported how Diana snuck food into the basement in which Sylvia was hidden. A neighbor had also reported the incidents to a public health nurse, who, upon entering the home and not seeing Sylvia for she was locked in a basement, concluded that nothing was wrong. Banaszewski had also managed to convince the nurse that she had kicked the Likens girls out. Other next-door neighbors allegedly were aware of how Sylvia was abused. They had seen Paula strike the girl in the Banaszewski home on 2 separate occasions, but claimed not to report the abuse because they feared for their own lives. Jenny was threatened, bullied, and beaten by the Banaszewskis and neighbor girls alike should she go to the authorities. The abuse of Sylvia continued unhindered, in fact, aided by all those around her. "I'm going to die," Sylvia told her sister 3 days before she did. "I can tell." Gertrude could tell too, and so she forced Sylvia to write a note in which she told her parents that she'd run away. Sylvia was also forced to write that she'd met up with a group of boys and given them sexual favors, and afterward, they'd beaten her and mutilated her body. Shortly after this, Sylvia overheard Gertrude Banaszewski tell her children that she was going to take Sylvia to a forest and leave her there to die. A desperate Sylvia Likens attempted one final escape. She managed to get out the front door before Gertrude caught her. Sylvia was so weak from her injuries she could not have possibly gotten too far. With the assistance of a neighbor boy named Coy Hubbard, Gertrude beat Sylvia with a curtain rod until she fell unconscious. Then, when she came back to, she stomped on her head. Sylvia was dead by October 26, 1965, from a brain hemorrhage, shock, and malnutrition. After 3 months of torture and starvation, she could no longer form intelligible words and could barely move her limbs. When the police came, Gertrude stuck with her cover story. Sylvia had been out with boys in the woods, she told them, and they'd beaten her to death and carved "I am a prostitute and proud of it" into her body. Jenny, though, took her chance. As soon as she could get close enough to a police officer, she whispered, "Get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." The police arrested Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Banaszewski, Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard for murder. Neighborhood participants Mike Monroe, Randy Lepper, Darlene McGuire, Judy Duke, and Anna Sisko were also arrested for injury to person. These minors would blame Gertrude for being pressured to partake in the slaughter of Sylvia Likens. Gertrude herself pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. "She's not responsible," her defense attorney told the court, "because she's not all here." There were several more children involved who proved just too young to be charged. Ultimately, though, on May 19, 1966, Gertrude Banaszewski was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. She was spared the death penalty despite her own lawyer admitting that, in my opinion, she ought to go to the electric chair. Paula Banaszewski, who had given birth to a daughter during the trial, was convicted of second-degree murder and was also sentenced to life imprisonment. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Banaszewski Jr. were all convicted of manslaughter and given 2 to 21-year prison sentences, based on the fact that they were minors. The 3 boys were all paroled just 2 years later, in 1968. Gertrude spent 20 years behind bars. There was no question about her guilt. The autopsy backed up everything Jenny told the police. Sylvia Likens had died slowly and painfully over several months. In 1971, both Gertrude and Paula were retried to the result that Gertrude was again found guilty. Paula pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 2 to 21 years. She once even managed to escape despite being recaptured. After about 8 years behind bars, Paula was released, and she moved to Iowa, where she changed her name and became a teacher's aide. She was suspended from her position when in 2012 an anonymous caller tipped off the school district that Paula was once convicted of the death of 16-year-old Sylvia Likens. Gertrude Banaszewski was granted parole on good behavior on December 4, 1985. Jenny and a whole crowd of people picketed outside the prison to protest her release, but it was no use. Gertrude Banaszewski was set free. The only relief Jenny received came 5 years after Gertrude's release, when the murderess died of lung cancer. "Some good news," Jenny wrote to her mother with a copy of the woman's obituary. "Damn old Gertrude died. Ha ha ha. I am happy about that." Jenny never did blame her parents for what happened to her sister. "My mom was a really good mom," Jenny has said. "All she did was trust Gertrude." If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video. And turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.